Hello, Red Nation podcast listeners. I am Akash Poyam and I'm guest hosting today's episode. I belong to the Gond tribe from Chhattisgarh state in India. I'm a researcher and a writer and currently working as a faculty at the Asian College of Journalism, Chennai. I'm also the founder of Adivasi Resurgence, an online platform archiving the writings by Adivasi and tribal writers in India. In today's episode, I'll be talking to Professor Bhangya Bhukya, who is an Adivasi scholar from Lambada community based in Telangana state of India. Adivasi scholars in Indian academia have rarely found space or recognition due to the lack of implementation of affirmative action policy and the hegemony of Brahmin and upper caste Hindus in higher educational institutes. However, Professor Bhukya is among the few Adivasi scholars whose work has been pioneering in the field of history and Adivasi studies. He has a PhD from Warwick University, where he worked under the supervision of Professor David Hardman, a founding member of the Subaltern Studies Group. He was also a British Council visiting fellow at School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Professor Bhukya is a he's a professor of history at University of Hyderabad. His research interest includes community histories, the effects of power, knowledge, governmentality, and dominance, the state and nationalism, intellectual histories of subaltern communities, identity politics by forest and hill people in the 19th and 20th century. Professor Bhukya has authored four books: The Lambadas, a community besieged, Subjugated Nomads, The Lambadas under the rule of Nizams, Roots of the Periphery, A History of the Goans of Deccan India, and History of Modern Telangana and a Cultural History of Telangana, from the earliest to 1724. You can find links to some of Professor Bhukya's essays and books in the description. These books have been instrumental in bringing out people's history and the history of the Deccan region in particular. It is also one of the first attempts to document the history of the Lambada and the Gond community in English. I first met Professor Bhukya during my MA program at University of Hyderabad and have been following his work since. Professor Bhukya's work, his research papers, have been especially helpful in critically looking at Indian history writing and Adivasi people's place in it. Professor Bhukya is currently a Fulbright Nehru Academic and Professional Excellence Scholar at the University of Pennsylvania. Before beginning into the uh, podcast, I would first maybe we can talk a little bit about how this episode came about. So, I I was contacted by a friend, Ratik Ashokan, who used to work with the Baffler earlier, and he told me that Professor Bhukya was giving a talk and he was going to attend it. And then he suggested that, he introduced me and Professor Bhukya to Nick Estes, and then from there on, there was a conversation about how there should be an episode on the Adivasis, who are the indigenous people of India, and how that could give a kind of an introduction to the listeners of Red Nation podcast and give them a sense of Adivasi politics, Adivasi society, and their current discourse and struggles, resistance, and how there is also a shared experience of these communities in indigenous communities in the West, in the US, Canada, as well as in India and other countries. Uh, Before starting with the questions, I would like to share some experience that I had at University of Hyderabad. When I went to study MA there, Hyderabad has a significant number of Adivasi students who come from the Gond community, which is my tribe. And when I went to University of Hyderabad, I was studying sociology and I started reading, looking for more research papers and articles on Gonds and Gonds history. And it was then that I came across Professor Bhukya's work. And I remember going to meet him for the first time. I wrote an email to him saying, that I'm interested in his work and I would like to meet him. So after that, his work has been specifically very interesting for me because it gives a sense of Goan's history in Deccan India, in Central India. His work has also been on the history of Lambada community to which he belongs to, and Goand and Lambada communities are one of the two of the most prominent communities in Telangana, and I think there is a lot that we can you know discuss in this conversation. Given that Professor Bhukya, given that this conversation is primarily aimed at listeners who are outside of India who do not know anything about Adivasi or tribal communities in India, I think we should begin with a much simpler, maybe a very basic understanding of who are the Adivasis. So we should, can you tell us roughly like who are the Adivasis? How many tribes are there in India? Which parts of the country they are located in, based in, and what are the names of some of the bigger communities? Uh, and at last, if it is a lot of questions, maybe I can break these down.
Yeah, this is, I mean, so I can give some broad introduction of indigenous communities in India. I think that should be fine. Yeah. I got the sense of your question, what you're trying to ask. Okay. Thank you, Akash, at the outset for the generous introduction and making the background of Adivasi communities in India. I mean, say indigenous people in India are popularly called Adivasis, but state describes them scheduled tribes. The Adivasi population is about 100 million, uh, more than 100 million, and it constitutes something about 8.5% of India's population. And the government of India has recognized something about 705 communities so far, but this list goes on increasing as they discover new communities over the time. So, and coming to the demography of Adivasi communities in India, largely, I mean, so we can say there are two major parts. One is mainland India, and the other is northeastern India. Okay, they are, I mean, constitutionally classified as fifth schedule and sixth schedule. That is how they are not described in the constitution. The 80 about 80% actually um, lives in fifth schedule areas, and about 10 to 12% in the northeast India. Means it's very difficult to actually to comprehend the number of communities and social stratification within the communities, the racial components, and the differences between the communities in India. They're huge actually. So within the community, again, you have so many, I mean, so sub communities, right? Subsects, which are again very distinguished from the other community. I mean, so I can say within the Gond, there are many other sub communities. Within the Lambadas, again, there is many other sub communities like this. I mean, and they are not treated or considered as a separate communities. And from these, I mean, the recent times there are growing assertion of the sub communities as well within the larger communities. So I mean, so broadly we can say there are about 15 large communities in India, like Bhils, Gonds, Santals, Minas, Nayakdas, Oraos, Lambadis, Mundas, Khasis, Nagas, Baros, Khols, Varlis. These are major dominant communities. Particularly central India constitutes the major part, Madhya Pradesh, say Bihar, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, these states, and Maharashtra also, Telangana, Rajasthan, Gujarat, constitutes a major part of the Adivasi communities in India. Of course, Northeast India is almost 70 to 80% are not tribal, constitutes tribal population or indigenous people. So yeah, this is what the broad demography of Indian indigenous communities in India. Yeah, the other question, why they are not considered as indigenous communities, is another question I think you asked. Of course, there is a lot of politics behind this. Although Indian government part of the UNO Declaration of Indigenous Communities Rights, but Indian government still um, declined that there is no indigenous existence of indigenous communities in India.
Right, Professor Bhukya. I mean, even though the spread of Adivasi communities from the east to west or north to south is across the country, uh, and you have a very long history of Adivasi communities settling in these areas. Despite that, what do you think? Say how has academia or history writing has influenced this idea of who is indigenous in India, or shaped the idea of who is indigenous in India, and why even scholars are hesitant to use the term indigenous people for Adivasis, arguing that India has had multiple waves of migration and there is no one who is indigenous here, right? So can you?
Yeah, sure, Akash. Yes. Yeah, this kind of argument developed during the, I mean, it's the last phase of the colonial period. Particularly, sociologists like G.S. Gure, strongly, argued that no, there is no, indigenous community, in India. The fact that India witnessed many waves of migration from Central Asia and Europe as well. So I mean, so the migration history is very long. Okay, when it comes to America or Canada, Australia, they, I mean, it's, settlers migration history is a very short, some for 500 years history. And communities, native communities of these lands, they know that these communities migrated to their areas very recently. But in the Indian case, since the migration happened, in very distance past, it's very difficult to assert that indigenousness. Okay, and as you see, I mean, in history, after the Aryan migration to India, the indigenous people were increasingly pushed towards hills and to the margin, and this is a continuous process throughout the history. So as empires were, as I argue in my roots of the periphery, as the empire or state expanding towards the hills, the Adivasi communities, the aboriginal communities or indigenous communities were moving further deep into forests. So it's a very long history, yeah. But the question is like, who were the first settlers, okay, in a particular land? All now human history is nothing but migration. Okay, everyone is migrating. Even Adivasi communities, indigenous communities migrate from one place to another place within the forest and hills. But when we assert a particular right over a particular piece of land or territory, what actually comes there is who was the first settler. He is treated as the original or indigenous of that particular land. The same principle should be applied in the Indian case as well. I mean, when there is a dispute between the Adivasi communities, this is what comes, and that is how they, settle, dispute, boundaries, disputes between the communities. Okay, so you settled first in this land, and I settled in this land first. So that is how it goes. Yeah, but unfortunately, our professional academics and sociologists, anthropologists don't go by the community's aspirations. Okay, largely, of course, go by the their own political positions and their affiliation to particular political ideology. Say, Guriak, I mean, so was influenced by Hindu nationalism, and of course, even Srinivas works largely influenced by Brahmanism. So we cannot dispute that. I mean, so whatever they say about Adivasi communities were heavily loaded with their political positions.
Right, right, right. Uh, so going ahead, I mean, can we tell our listeners what is the, say, where do Adivasi people stand in terms of their socioeconomic position in India, in comparison to, say, vis-a-vis mainstream, quote unquote, mainstream society, and what kind of occupations they do, and and then we'll talk about other things. If you could just give us a overview of their socioeconomic situation, and in general, in comparison to quote unquote mainstream society, you know.
Akash, yeah, as you see in the social stratification of Indian society, Adivasis stands at the bottom, and the same thing applies to development aspects as well. Adivasis stands at the bottom in all development indicators. Say it is literacy rate or no, say malnutrition or no, poverty level or whatever indicator you take, they stand at the bottom. Adivasis basically, I mean, most of the communities historically involved in agriculture, fishing, and some art works, and crafts, and some cultural activities like storytelling and pharmacy and various other things. So, of course, hunting was the main occupation, fishing was the main occupation still for some communities, particularly in islands, even in mainlands, India as well. But now, I think, of course, all communities are now rural communities and largely now involved in agriculture. So you can say about 80% Adivasis are now involved or practice agriculture, and something about you can say 20% are now agricultural laborers. And these days you also see massive Adivasi migration to urban areas as construction laborers. So, and there is also kind of diversification of occupations. Some are coming very a small percentage, you can say 1 or 2% in education and various other occupations as well, but largely still in agriculture.
And I mean, how do we describe their relationship with the Indian state at present, and say what kind of everyday violence and oppression that Adivasi communities are facing? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure, Akash. I mean, I've been, I mean, arguing, and this is a fact as well. I mean, for Adivasis, state is the biggest enemy. Okay, particularly the modern state. I mean, because their question, I mean, Adivasi's question is basically a political question. Okay, they have been demanding for self-rule and self-determinism right from the colonial period. This was the period when they lost all their political powers and control over their territories. Of course, they lost their culture as well. This was the period when they came to go, closer contact with the larger society as well. So there was, I think, a complete loss. Okay, in terms of power, in terms of resources, in terms of culture, everything. Okay, and this all happened because of the expansion of modern state in the hills and forest areas. Okay, so so the main fight of the Adivasis is against the state. Although they have been negotiating with the state in many aspects, they have actually uh, carved out some space within the modern state, we must say, agree that. And we are today here discussing, it's all part of that negotiation. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been to access modern education and come up to this level. I mean, so there is some change and some progress, but state is still so hostile to Adivasi communities. For example, say the implementation of PESA Act or no implementation of Forest Acts, land question is unsettled. So there are a lot of issues actually related to state, and the state is completely insensitive to Adivasi question. So yeah, I mean, so, the straightforward question is, I mean, answer to your question is like the relation between Adivasis and state is very hostile. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, uh, that hostility is very visible, especially in central India, in the eastern India, or wherever this so-called red corridor is there, right? I mean, we'll go into a detailed question later, but just to kind of bring it here that state's hostility is very visible violence that, for example, in the state of Chhattisgarh, where I come from, you see incidences of encounters and rapes almost every week, every day, and most of these stories never make into even a national news or anything. So the it looks like it's not a larger or say a large scale problem, but if you even add up just statistics of last 10-20 years, you see that thousands of people have died or been kidnapped or have experienced sexual violence and so on and so forth, right? So uh, when we look at this kind of violence and for example, I remember seeing this picture of it's probably a sketch by some British artist of a Santal village being burnt during the colonial period, right? And so a few years ago, I mean, not a few years ago, in 2005, when Salva Judum, this kind of counterinsurgency sort of group by the state, where the state was arming, civilians and telling them to fight Maoists. This started. There were several cases, documented cases of the houses being burned. So it was a similar tactics that was used. So I mean, the question is that these realities, can we say that Adivasi communities are still living largely under a colonial context right now? You know.
Yeah, very right, Akash. Yeah, as you're mentioning, this using the indigenous communities against their own brothers, it's not a new phenomena. It actually started during the early colonial period itself. The East India Company itself actually worked out such kind of mechanisms in which they identified some Adivasis, recruited them, formed as a kind of bond to attack on the Adivasi communities. So, and the same tradition, I think now Indian government is adapting. So Salvajudum is in a way nothing but a kind of a continuation of colonial kind of tradition where they formed say Gond corps and Bhil corps to crush down their own people. Okay, so and unfortunately now whether it is Maoist or no Selvajudum, it is ultimately it is the Adivasis who are dying from both parties. Okay, and the kinds of violence happening in central India or even northeast India, the armed forces violence against the ethnic groups in Northeast India is hot burning. So, I mean, so there are rapes, and there are fatherless childrens. Many children's born without their father, so they don't know who is their father. So these kinds of things are there, and happening and still happening. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think just because we are talking about how there is a continuity in the violence from colonial period to the post-colonial period. Can you also talk a little bit about, say, genealogy and the construction of Adivasi and tribal identity in Indian subcontinent broadly? By which I mean I'm also kind of asking for whether whether before colonial period, how did, say, uh, Brahminical texts or Hindu texts, you know, they depicted Adivasis, and then how colonial anthropology depicted Adivasis, So, can you maybe reflect on that a bit and how this identity has evolved over the years?
Okay, Akash. Yeah. See, whatever derogatory descriptions we have now on Adivasis are basically colonial productions. But we cannot completely blame the colonial anthropology only. Colonial anthropology again sourced all these derogatories from Brahmanical texts. Okay, so during the colonial period, what these Orientalists did is they translated all the Sanskrit literature, and whatever kind of descriptions were given in the Orient or Sanskrit literature was reproduced in a way in the colonial anthropology as well. So Adivasi communities were described as Mlechas in the early period, and later on as Vanavasis, basically Vanavasis, Vanacharas. I mean, so basically, or what you call of human, like Hanuman kind of things. Wali Sugriev's description, if you see, very clearly you can make out how the Brahmanical texts described Adivasi communities very, very derogatorily. So there is a kind of continuity, in stereotyping Adivasi communities, but particularly in colonial anthropology, there is a kind of overloaded emphasis on the Adivasi communities. So in their task to distinguish forest and mainland communities, they in a way overemphasize the forest communities, how, and try to show how barbaric these communities and all. So for them, caste societies are slightly civilized communities, and the Adivasi communities are barbaric, violent, uncivilized, okay, dacoit, criminal. So these are the kinds of tags they have given to Adivasi communities, and these stereotypes have been again reproduced in the post-colonial literature as well. So this has been continuing, but from say early 1930s, there was a kind of self assertion by the communities, and this term tribe was replaced by Adivasi, the term Adivasi, which we are using now. And this was is also in a way given by some outsiders. This is what colonial document says. But since these terms has some kind of political assertion, the communities, Adivasi communities, owned it, and they have been using it. Particularly the activists are now using it. And now it became very popular in India. The term Adivasi became very popular. So it has been now. I mean, there is a kind of, particularly in the mainland India, other than northeastern state, the word became popular, and the political assertion is made through this language of Adivasis. So yeah, in a way, it's going in a very positive direction, I must say. Yeah.
Right, right. I just wanted to add there that, uh, even uh, for example, when we talk about how, when you said that how colonial government referred Adivasis as barbaric, right, or the idea of savage, primitive, this comes from. Professor Ramdayal Munda, in one of his talks, talks about this kind of a four-tier hierarchy in the Brahminical texts, Brahminical Hindu texts. He says that some were referred as superhuman, as in Sura, Deva, Yaksha. Some were human, as Nara, Manava. Some were subhuman, such as Vanara and Kinnara, and then there were unhuman or inhuman, who were Asura, Rakshasa, and Danava. And he says that, Adivasis and tribals would fall in the last two categories, right? So I think Professor Ramdayal Munda is also pointing at how, say, this dehumanization of Adivasi communities is not something that just began with the coming of the colonial rule, but it has been ingrained in the Hindu Brahminical uh, mythologies and texts. Yeah. Uh, so, so can you, in continuation of this, can you reflect on maybe because I mean, this dehumanization is very important. I feel the term is very important because, for example, how the Brahminical texts also do not give Adivasis uh, the you know. Uh, uh, they don't give them they don't identify them or recognize them as fully human, so there is still non-human or inhuman, unhuman, all sort of, they are asuras, they are vanaras, they are danavas. So they are not human. In a similar way, colonial anthropology, or when we look at how, with the Enlightenment period, how this idea of primitive comes, there is a very similar kind of, so, and even in, say, post-colonial India, right now the term is changed, but the communities which are now known as PVTG communities, they were known as primitive tribal groups, and the term primitive is itself is very much is still in practice in India. Yeah, yeah. So in this way, is it correct to say that violence against Adivasi communities only begins with, say, colonialism, or can you talk a little bit about, say, pre-colonial Adivasi history, maybe, and how, how that there is a continuity in kind of violence on Adivasis in the ancient history or in the later period, or what, how do you look at it basically?
Uh, See, as I said earlier, there is a long history of Adivasi suppression and exploitation in Indian history. So it was not just started during the colonial period. The kind of treatment Adivasis had in pre-colonial period continued even during the colonial and post-colonial period. I don't see any change in their position, particularly social, cultural, and let's say economic position and all that. So the only difference was between colonial and post-colonial was like I mean, hills and forests were loosely controlled by the pre-colonial states and empire. So they had some freedom and some autonomy to decide their things themselves. Okay, so they were driven to forest areas, but they were not brought under the control of the mainstream state or empire. Okay, they were governing themselves, they were ruling themselves. That kind of thing was there. And to some extent, pre-colonial state believed in multiple sovereignties, not one singular sovereignties. Even if you take big empires like say Guptan Empire or Sultanate or Mughal Empire, so they conquer particular territory and again return it back to the local rajas, and they govern themselves according to their traditions and practices. So that kind of tradition was there. But what Britishers did is they tried to bring all the communities under the state control and establish one singular sovereignty or singular sovereign state. That is where the whole problem is. And they also see that this nomadism or uh, um, leaving large area outside the state is dangerous to modern state. So and first of I mean, so another important thing is these communities are now asserting their power through collective rights. Okay, and modern state doesn't believe in collective rights. Modern state functions only on individual citizenship rights. Okay, so once you are made individual, you become vulnerable and weak, and state easily can control you, suppress you, exploit you. Can I mean, state can do anything else. Okay, so state always try to weaken the community bonds and suppress you, and all that being a state is doing. So and same thing has been continuing. And the other thing, the construction of the Adivasis as as you say, Vanaras and Rakshasas and all this, and barbaric, uncivilized during the colonial period. So these constructions are not simple constructions. Okay, there is a politics behind that. Okay, so by stereotyping the Adivasi communities, they try to suppress them politically and culturally. Okay, saying that no, you are inferior, right? So it creates a kind of a psychological inferiority complex in you, right? So that is how the pre-colonial cultural Brahmanical cultural hegemony did. And during the colonial period also, they again reproduced the same kind of stereotypes. By doing that, I mean, so particularly with the development of professional anthropology, they describe them as childlike and primitive, and you are at the bottom of the modern civilization. So by saying that you cannot handle your things yourself, right? So let the state handle on behalf of you. Okay, so this is basically a project to deny self rule and self determinism to the Adivasi communities. Okay, so these constructions are very political construction. They are not just simple construction. That is how I see, and this is fact. This is fact. So that is what has been happening. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, this construction is also, in the sense, in the post-colonial period, it gets, reproduced again and again through academia or media and so on and so forth, right? So, and and I mean, because yeah, yeah. Professor Bhukya, also, I mean, this just reminded me that, for example, in Roots of the Periphery, you talk about, say, you know, how, okay, sorry, I'll go to that question later. But my question was that basically say, medieval period, or say during the period when there were Gond kingdoms in the central India, right? Even during that period, there was a lot of, say, influence of Hinduism that came into the these kingdoms, right? And I remember you mentioning that there was some sort of a negotiation that Adivasi rulers did. So, uh, I mean, what I'm asking is that even say pre-colonial period, in the colonial period there is continuous, obviously, influx of Hinduism and Brahminism in Adivasi areas. But even in the medieval period, there seems to be such uh, intervention of Hinduism.
Yeah. See, by 12th century, means that's before coming of the Sultanate rule in India. Adivasis almost driven to hill areas, say whether it is Western Ghats or no uh, Vindhya Satpuras of central India, or no Eastern Ghats or Himalayas. So they were actually driven to completely to hills, and the whole of the mainland was occupied by the caste Hindus. And very interestingly, from 12th century, they asserted their power in the hills and formed their own kingdoms. Okay, and then there were of course tension between the big empire and this Adivasi kingdoms, particularly Garha was conquered by Mughal army, and Kerala was also occupied by defeated by the Mughal army, and then Marathas conquered Devgad and Chanda kingdoms. So there were some four very powerful states, Adivasi kingdoms in central India. And once you capture political power, and then you cannot actually live in isolation. You do have to have some relation with your neighbors. So there were all kinds of things were now happening, and there were a lot of sharing between the mainland empire and Adivasi or Gond kingdoms. Okay, so the ruling of that period, the political philosophy of that period was largely governed by Brahmanical values. Okay, like I mean, so, uh, I can put it like this: the Brahmanical ruling values. Okay, so as a kshatriya, as a ruler, now you have to perform certain things, right? Some puja, some worshipping of Hindu gods and all that. So then immediately the Brahmin would also come into your court, and then he give you some lineage or no link your clan with the Kshatriya lineage or no some Brahmanical lineage. So all these kinds of no things actually were no happening. So and yeah, I mean, so within the Gonds, I mean, Haimandrao also describes them Rajgons. I mean, okay. So from where this term is actually coming, Rajgons. But and when I visited these Rajgond village areas and some families of Raja, they were going for coolie. I met them, on the road, in a coolie, adda. So, I mean, so, these things were happening during the, colonial, period. And some of these rajas, I mean, so, I have seen in the Chanda kingdom, I mean, so they actually even adapt, Muslim rulers' titles as well. Shah, I mean, the king. Yeah, Singh was replaced with Shah later period with the influence of the Muslim ruler. So there was definitely a kind of cross, I mean cultural cross pollination of ideas that you can see, and I mean it's very difficult to avoid as well. But one important thing you see is their identity is honored and respected. Okay, so it is not just again M.N. Srinivas complete Sanskritization, right? Okay, so it is like adapting certain things for a political purpose, right? So initially they adapt this title of Singh, right, and Raos, and then they adapt this Shah titles. Okay, so these titles were shifting as the monarchical power were changing at the larger level. So these are not fixed titles or something like that. So I see them as a political strategy. Okay, and Adivasis are very clever in that sense. Okay, they are not stupid as they are being described by the our colonial anthropologists. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, before moving on to the next question, it's very interesting that you say that, because this assertion of Adivasi communities during 1930s, say, the Adivasi term comes, Adivasi Mahasabha is formed, and so on and so forth. In the Gondwana region, in 1916, you have Gondwana Mahasabha being formed, which is reconstituted in 1930 as Akhil Bharati Gondwana Mahasabha. So these are major Adivasi organizations during the colonial period who are asserting their rights, right? And it is also the same time period when British anthropologists like Very Relvin or later say Gurre or M.N. Srinivas are also writing. So despite having a very active presence of political assertion, social assertion, and assertion against Hinduism, of their own religion, and so on, in these, pre-independence period. Despite that, these scholars and anthropologists, they continue to, devalue them and speak of them as, uncivilized and primitive and so on. Yeah. Uh, in relation to say Indian society would primarily be considered a caste society, right? And but here, so if Indian society is largely a caste society, then how do we understand this intersection of Hindu caste system and Adivasi tribal identity? This I'm specifically asking this question in reference to, say, your reference in Roots of the Periphery, where you talk about how it was part of the British colonial policy to, settle caste Hindus into the Adivasi areas. So, can you maybe elaborate on that and tell us why the colonial government wanted to settle Hindus and what kind of influence that settlement has had over the longer period till now?
See, a very long and big question actually. It's a lot of time, but I'll make it a shortcut. In the sense, as is rightly said, Indian society is basically caste society, but in the fourfold Varnasma classification, Adivasis doesn't fit anywhere. I mean, there is no reference of these communities. Okay, basically they are outside this fourfold Varna system. Okay, so and later on, of course, these Varnas were now proliferated into castes during the Gupta's period. And of course, there were many tribes getting into castes. Like once they, the striking example is Rajput tribes. Okay, basically all the Rajput tribes, Chawan, Pamar, and other groups. Once they captured a political power in the Western India, they transformed into kind of caste-like communities, and then Brahmin immediately grabbed this opportunity and link their clan with the Surya Vamsha, Chandra Vamsha of Brahmanical lineage, and completely assimilate them into their fold, and that is how all the Rajput tribes become caste. And there are many other communities actually becomes tribes, or Adivasis become caste kind of groups. And there are also some communities who became a tribe as well. Okay, I mean, there was caste-based suppression in the village society, so they run away from the village and settle in the forest areas. Now, during the war period, many villages they decamp their village and flood, flee away to forest areas. So, like this, certain communities. So once they cut off from the caste society, village society, and settle in the forest areas, they become Adivasi kind of communities. Okay, and some communities are nomadic communities who are traveling between the two areas of forest and caste society or mainland India. So very, I mean, so, broadly actually you can comprehend the Indian communities as caste society, nomadic society, and forest groups. So and these categories very much still exist, right? Um, and of course they have been produced and reproduced during the colonial period. And this attempt to bring these Adivasi communities into Brahmanical fold became more overwhelming, and what do you call, uh, we can say that was a this were actually happening as a result of the larger development happening in India. Okay, so I see this like the communal politics which developed in India from say 1920s was actually leading to this kind of politics. So Adivasi areas were seen as no man's land. Okay, they are now free from the institutionalized religions. Okay, so missionaries were going first and converting some of the Adivasis, and then of course there was some conversion during the medieval period into Islam as well. And and from late 19th century there was this Arya Samaj particularly, and Hindu Mahasabha. They were going into Adivasi areas and converting the Adivasis into this Brahmanical fold and all that. So, and not only the converting Adivasis into Brahmanical fold, but even the Adivasi gods and goddesses were given some Hindu god colors, and they were now assimilated into Hindu gods, pantheons of Hindu gods. So this was actually happening in a bigger way, particularly during the 1920s and 30s. So there was a kind of race to increase your religion number, during this period of communal politics, particularly this Hindu Muslim communal politics had a serious impact on the Adivasi communities. So there was a pressure by the Hindu groups and the colonial state to enumerate Adivasi communities, despite their own claims into a Hindu fold. Till 1931 census, Adivasis were enumerated under different categories, as Christians, as enemies, as different religion. But from 31 census, irrespective of their claims, all the Adivasis are enumerated as Hindus, unless they claim Muslim or Christians. Okay, so that is what actually happened. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Uh, so I mean, uh, this the this history of Hinduism. Can you talk, maybe touch upon a little in the colonial period, as I was mentioning earlier, how colonial policy was to settle caste Hindus in the tribal areas?
Yeah. Sorry, I missed that point. See, I mean, the colonial state saw the caste societies as more sober, okay, sober and then easy to handle, because they were responding to colonial exploitation and colonial rule in a very passive way, right? Whereas the Adivasis were now responding in a very violent way, okay. So, and this societies were now wild and rugged and responding very spontaneously. So these all things were there, and British could not handle these things. Okay, so their idea was, I mean, the British colonial state idea was, if this caste communities migrate into Adivasi areas and develop some contact and impact the Adivasi communities, they would also become like caste Hindu peasants, and become just caste like community. Then it would be very easy for the colonial state to actually control the Adivasis. And when there was this Tana Bhagat movement, and there was a Devi movement in the Western India, these are like kind of vegetarian movement among the Adivasi communities. Nothing to do with, again, with Gandhian vegetarian movement, but how I see is like kind of a self technology, what Foucault talks about, developed within the community. So when there is a serious challenge to the community itself adopt certain technologies to overcome the challenge. Okay, so it was as the conditions become impossible for the Adivasis with the expansion of the colonial state and migration of the caste Hindus in the Adivasi areas. They have to interact, negotiate with these new groups. Okay, and their existing pattern of life doesn't allow such kind of negotiation. So there were attempts to transform themselves to become sober. Okay, even to get or borrow money from the caste Hindus. They should impress the caste Hindu money lender that he is a sober and he will not run away after taking or after borrowing money. So there were these kinds of conditions created by the colonial state, under which the communities try to transform themselves, and that is how. And along with this process, lot of caste brahmanical values actually entered into the Adivasi communities.
Right, right. So this happens primarily during the colonial period, right?
Yes, 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 yeah. And it becoming more and more in the post-colonial period. Yeah.
I just wanted to add a point that just like in Canada and in Australia, the work of Christian missionaries and how they were residential schools where the term cultural genocide is used. So, in a similar way, in India, for example, when one of the followers of Gandhi, Thakkar Bapa, and his followers, they start this ashram school model in Gujarat among the Bhil people, right? And that gets institutionalized into the Indian education system. And right now we have ashram schools across India, which are nothing but a kind of a institute of cultural genocide, right?
Yeah, you're very right. Actually, even I mean, some missionaries and colonial state. There was this Rajkumar College in Ranchi, where all the Gond Rajas, chiefs, childrens were brought and put in this school and trained on the kind of a modern line. They were taught modern agriculture and various other modern colonial values. Okay. So, and as you said, this ashram school was a very dangerous thing. So it's basically, grabbing, Adivasi children from their mother's womb and, putting them in a completely, different, world. Okay. And what they teach all, foreign language. Of course, curriculum is a foreign, and language is a foreign, and everything. I mean, it's, what you learn in Indian education institutions is basically Hinduism. Of course, on the name of nationalism, the Indian education institutions are built on Brahmanical values and Brahmanical philosophies, and that is what you are taught, and your brain is washed, just like missionaries did in Canada, Australia, and parts of America as well. Yeah. So you have very similar shared history across the globe. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You're right, Professor Bhukya. This shared history is of colonialism, and probably this is why a lot of these institutes are common in the way colonial violence was perpetuated on people is also very similar. Now, moving on to the post-colonial period in India, how would you say that, the Indian government has treated the Adivasis, or how have they responded to the question of Adivasi autonomy or recognition of Adivasi language or religion and so on, how do you say how do you see Indian state in the post-colonial period broadly?
Yeah, I must say, uh, the post-colonial states' position on the question of Adivasis uh, is more disastrous than the colonial state. That is how I put it. At least under British colonialism, there was some I mean, so they put in a separate, zone and all that. I mean, so if you go by 1935 Act, start from 1874 Scheduled Districts Act, which gives some kind of protection. Yeah, Scheduled Area Act gives some kind of protection. Okay, but I am now working on this aspects, and now I saw the constitutional assembly debates. It's horrifying. Okay, the way the caste Hindus articulating Adivasi question is really really very bothering. So, and whatever they had some kind of protection under colonialism was completely taken away, right? Okay. And Jaipal Singh Munda was roaring in the Constituent Assembly, but nobody was actually listening him, taking him seriously. Okay, and whatever they wanted to do, they have done it. I mean, everything was defined, decided on the name of national integration. Okay, so they say national integration is important. Okay, so we cannot go. I mean, go on giving the rights to these communities. That would be a disaster to the new nation. That is the language they were speaking. So, on the name of national integration, Adivasis were now denied all kinds of rights. Okay, particularly the fifth schedule area Adivasis literally have nothing in the constitution, right? To some extent, sixth schedule indigenous communities, that's Northeast India, have some mechanism under the banner of, say, district councils and village council and intra village council. There is some kind of power given to these communities. But when it comes to mainland India, there is nothing. I mean, so whatever the structure you have in the plain area, same structure you have in the so-called scheduled areas as well. Okay, and in a way, it is more rigorous. I mean, so recently I visited some areas in Gadchiroli and Jharkhand areas. I mean, so, police, armed forces come in truck in the morning and dump people. I mean, so, cops here and there, and again evening the same truck come and collect all the cops back and go to nearby town and stay there. So I mean, so the policing and vigilance is more vigorous in the Adivasi or scheduled areas than the plain areas. In the plain areas, slightly things are better. I still remember my childhood. There was a, I think till my 10th class, there was a police camp in our school. Okay, and always there will be a camp and people going and coming. I mean, cops. I think there was some kind of shift, and I still remember now playing cricket with the police people on the school ground. So that is how we grow up. So and I mean, what I'm trying to tell you is uh, plain areas slightly better. I mean, it's less policed than the Adivasi areas. Okay, so then you can understand how things are going there.
Right. So, I mean, there doesn't, I mean, you're saying that the post colonial state is even more brutal and violent towards the Adivasi communities, right? Whether it comes to the, you know, whether it comes to the ongoing violence or occupation of land for industries and mining and so on, right? So, I mean, then in that sense, can we say, can we uh, say if there is any benefit, say, or or harm? I mean, there is a lot of harm that we can talk about that has come to Adivasis under the Indian rule. But do you think, for example, have there been any benefits? For example, this is a India has this affirmative action policy, right, where scheduled castes, Dalits, scheduled tribes, Adivasis, they are given representation in education, employment, and so on and so forth. The argument is that, if I'm correct, that the Dalit communities or scheduled caste communities are are beneficiaries of affirmative action because they have been marginalized and oppressed for several years, thousands of years by the Hindus, here in India. But when it comes to Adivasis, you see that your work also talks about how Adivasis are very much independent, autonomous, groups before the coming of the colonial period. At least they retain some sort of autonomy in the larger context, right? So. uh, I mean, can you talk about what kind of say assertions that have happened in the post-colonial period from Adivasi communities?
Um, Akash, yeah, I got the sense of your question. See, there is I must tell you, there is a striking difference between scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, right? For scheduled castes, state is actually in a way very liberative because they have been suppressed throughout the history, and they can claim certain rights under the state, modern state umbrella. Some public space they could carve out themselves because of the constitution safeguards and modern state other democratic values and so on. That is why Ambedkar always argued for a strong state which can implement whatever he laid down in the constitution. But for Adivasis, in the constitution making itself, great harm was done. Okay, and the whole, I mean, the state. I mean, Adivasis question is reverse in a way. I mean, the state is the biggest enemy for the Adivasis, right? Okay, because Adivasis question is a political question. Okay, Dalit question is more like a social question. I mean, so they were socially suppressed. Okay, so you make this difference, no? So that is why now state is literally after the Adivasi communities from the beginning. Okay, and whatever the damage has to done, that was done during the constitution making itself, and nobody actually bother about the Adivasi communities because Adivasi communities are not politically unified groups because we have number of ethnic groups, and they are divided on region and various other things, very difficult to explain. Okay, although I mean, so all the Adivasi communities and indigenous communities have common shared history of exploitation, suppression by the state. Somehow, a national leadership haven't yet emerged. Okay, they could not become a political voice at national level or at the state level. You see this in the Dalit communities, okay, scheduled caste communities. There is a national voice and as well as at a state level voice. If something happens to a Dalit in some corner of the country, there will be some huge and cry across the country. But every day in central India, in northeast India, Adivasi women were no raped and Adivasis were no killed. Nobody actually take note of it. Okay, so and all this justified on the name of nation and national integration and all that. Okay, so and of course this tag of anti-national is given to Adivasis, or they can brand you as Naxalite, Maoist. So it is very easy to suppress the Adivasi communities. So that is what happening. And coming to these affirmative actions, right? The Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi himself said, whatever is sanctioned, even not a 10% is reaching to the actual need is. Okay, so whatever the money is, if you go by the state government, central government allocations, there is a huge actually now, particularly after this the sub plan approach as adapted by central and state governments, huge money is allocated, but that money is not actually spent on the Adivasi development for some other purposes, right? And most time these allocations are diverted to some other areas. Okay, so that is what is happening. And of course there are some kind of patchworks are there, but there is no concrete program which can actually liberate Adivasis in a bigger ways. I see these two acts, I mean, the PESA Act as well as the Forest Rights Acts, I think the major acts, very positive acts, I must say, which would give some control and rights to the Adivasis. But unfortunately, they are not implemented. They are not implemented properly, right? You don't have village councils in any of these states. Okay, the normal panchayats are now set up in all the even scheduled areas. I really shocked when I came to know that the PESA Act has not been implemented in Jharkhand. It's a tribal state, right? So what else you can actually expect in other states? And the Forest Rights Act, it's really a very good act, but nothing actually is moving. No state is taking interest to implement this act. So what I am now arguing is like you're given rights like acts and safeguards and everything, but you don't have right to implement them. Okay, say for example, the central government passed this Forest Rights Act and put the implementation part on the state government. Okay, why the state government implement this, the act passed by the central government? No? So there are so many gaps in the implementation part, and it is because of this basically nothing is happening on the ground. That is my understanding. Yeah.
Yeah. I was actually, I mean, meaning to ask. I got diverted at that moment. Basically, I was meaning to ask that, for example, the reason of affirmative action is historical operation for the communities. In what sense, why does the Indian state give affirmative action to Adivasis? That was one thing. And then when you are saying that, Adivasi state has been, when we are talking about how state has been so violent, towards the Adivasis. Uh, but then again, in the post-colonial India, the same state also then comes up with, so many policies which seem to be, saying that the state wants to be inclusive, and but there are contradictions here, right? So I mean, say, for example, if you in Gadchiroli, in Maharashtra state, there is a Surjagarh mining that is happening, and there, a lot of the younger generation, say, who might be state government employees or teachers or something else, they are, or who might have a chance of employment in the mining, or in the state mining or private mining. They are not opposing the mines. And I mean, one of the interviews, I was told that, that it's mostly the elders who come to these protests. So what I'm saying is that, do you see that there is also this contradiction that Adivasi communities themselves are experiencing, where they are, kind of struggling to find their place in the state, at the same time challenging it?
Yeah, I mean, see, you must have seen this in the newspaper reporting, but our Indian media is completely sold media. Of course, they protect the interest of the capitalists, and of course, media itself is now capitalist, so that's a different story. But see. The educated section supporting or no inviting multinational companies is not true. But one thing I can tell you, now there is a kind of lumpen group developed within the Adivasi communities. Lumpen in the means mediocrates. Okay, who are these mediocres? These are school dropouts and intermediate dropouts who were brainwashed by the some local leaders or some influential personalities of their area. They are using them as a pawn, okay, to influence the common public, okay. But the common public, I mean, say the general public, know the impact or know the consequences of these kind of multinational companies coming into their areas. They have their own experiences, so definitely we have seen how Vedanta company was hit back, and and the whole struggle. I think you are aware of that. So of course, one of the successful movement and all that. So I mean, it's not like that. I don't agree that the some groups are now supporting, are now inviting multinational companies. These are media creation, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, so, um, I still have a lot of questions left.
Okay, sure, sure.
I hope you have time, Professor Bhukya.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah. Today I completely devoted for you. Yeah.
Continuing with the conversation, actually, I was what I meant to say is that, is that as you were saying that, there are groups that these mining companies themselves promote, or within the community they'll have their own people, like, to divide the group and so on, right? But I meant to ask, like, broadly, how do we look at Adivasi communities relationship with the state, where on one hand it perpetuates such kind of violence, visible violence, brutal violence, and on the other hand, it also promises these welfare schemes, or job opportunities within this same oppressive state, right? So, I mean, I know it's not it's a complicated kind of scenario, but can you reflect on that maybe briefly?
No, Akash, it is not very complicated. It is very clear that no, everyone has to fall in line, okay, in the line of the state. Okay, so and you take whatever I give you, okay, but don't demand too much. That is the state language. So as long as you speak within the state language, you are tolerated. But when think out of the basket, when you think differently, then you will be targeted. And you will be branded Maoist, you will be branded anti-national, all this. Okay, but otherwise they want to reach you out through this language of welfare schemes. Okay, so now, I mean, this welfareism is actually not helping the Adivasis in any way. That is how I see. Because, and particularly, I mean, so after 1990s, Indian state is gradually withdrawing from welfareism. Okay, so there is no welfareism as well. I mean, so they're I mean, so one by one, destroying all the public institutions which were very, very helpful to the downtrodden communities, Adivasis, Dalits, and all. Now we all have come up to this level because of the public education institutions and universities and all that. So now they all are at stake. Okay, so I don't think now the younger generation, at least come up to higher education. It's very impossible. Now the only way, of course, education is full of pain and other. There are so many difficulties. We know. I mean, so how we come up to this level. But this is the one way of articulate. I mean, so, articulating our question in a very critical way, and forging our agenda before the state, before the larger society, and all that. So that's happening, but not in a very bigger way. So yeah, I mean, so, as long as you speak within the state language, it's okay. But if you speak outside the state language, then there is a problem. Yeah.
Yeah. So in this context, for example, how do we then see? Say we were talking about the experiences of Dalit communities in India and how that is different from, say, Adivasi communities. So at present, say there is a strong growing assertion, a strong Dalit movement in India. And do you see a kind of a relationship, kind of a intersection between the Adivasi movements and Dalit movements? You know,
Yeah, there is some kind of alliance building up between Adivasis and Dalit groups. In some part, it is all because of Ambedkarite movements in various parts of India. So now Ambedkar became a kind of central figure for all the suppressed and downtrodden communities, and particularly the new educated section, in the Adivasi community, are actually um, uh, articulating their question completely different from their elders. Okay, So you would see something like, earlier the elder used to lead the community. Okay, so now it's shifted to the younger generation. So younger generation are forming, some organization, floating something, and organizing their elders, trying to educate their elders the consequences of, like, globalization, or say multinational companies, and environmental questions and all this. So they are actually articulating this in a different language, in a very critical language, and leading their communities. And it is again part of this only, they are trying to assert their own religion as well, their culture. So again they are going back to their roots. Okay, at one point there was a kind of I mean unconsciously or no conscious kind of assimilation. So but now there is a kind of reassertion of their culture, reassertion of their religion. So, and there is a now basically kind of demand and movement to enumerate Adivasi religion separately, in the census enumeration as well. So and there is a lot of solidarity coming up from the other groups, like other caste-based groups, Dalit groups. So I think something would happen in India very soon. I mean, so if all the suppressed group come together, then you would really have a different political movement in India. Yeah.
Okay. That was going to be my next question actually. That you know, Adivasi Hindu nahi hai. Adivasis are not Hindus. This slogan has become extremely popular, and you can see it written on the walls in parts of central India villages and so on. So this assertion that Adivasis are not Hindus, even though they have been enumerated in the census falsely since the independence as Hindus, right? So this phrase has become extremely popular over the last few years. And now, as you mentioned, that Adivasis are demanding a separate religious column in the census. So there is a strong growing assertion, religious assertion in Chota Nagpur region, in Gondwana region, and in other places. So, what do I mean? What do you think these anti-Brahminical assertions represent right now?
See, if you see the Indian culture, I mean, there are two kinds. One is a Brahminical culture, and the other is non-Brahminical. Okay. Historically, also there were Naga people who were the natives of this land, and you have Aryans who migrated from Central Asia and Europe. So, and particularly Adivasi communities still hold those historically built religious practices, traditions, and values. Okay, I mean, so say Naga worship is widespread among all the Adivasi communities. And also many downtrodden communities worship Naga. And there are, I mean, a lot of things still in existence. So and I mean, Adivasi belief system is very close to nature and production. Same case with the many other downtrodden communities as well. Means their guards, means village guards are very much close to production and other relations. So I mean, there is a strike. What I'm trying to tell you is there is a striking line boundary between Brahmanical gods and Adivasi gods, right? And of course, many of the Adivasi gods were given, Brahmanical gods' names, and they were assimilated into the Brahmanical Hindu gods. These are things are now happening. I mean, it's like I can tell you from my region, there was a Mallikarjuna Swami temple in Sri Salem. Basically, it was a kind of Chenchu Malaya temple. Okay, so this Chenchu, there is a tribe called Chenchu. They were the worshipper of this god, and from late medieval period, this temple completely converted into a Brahmanical temple. Same thing with in Orissa. I mean, Jagannath temple. Now Danteswari, they are also eyeing on Danteswari temple in Chhattisgarh. So that might very soon also get Brahmanized, and Danteswari might become some Durga or some other Devi. So these things are now happening. So it is against this. There is a now growing assertion among the Adivasis, particularly educated Adivasis, are now asserting their religion and demanding for separate enumeration in the census. So this is a basically a very welcoming development, because once you assert your culture, and then it is very easy to build political movement as well. Okay, because if you see any political movement in world, I mean, so they are now built on the cultural movements. So cultural movements slowly transform into a political movement. That's what happened. So I think it's a beginning of Adivasi politics in a different way, in India. Yeah.
Right. Uh, and I mean, I mean, it's not a question, just ending with a comment that I remember. Dr. Motiraman Kangali, he's one of the Gond scholars who who has documented Gondwana Mahasabha assemblies in the pre-independence period. And one of the assemblies, it's a very popular articulation that once Britishers leave India, Christians are going to leave with them, but the main destroyers of our land and culture, the Hindus, are going to stay. So what is the going to be benefit of this independence? So this kind of articulation has been there even in the pre-independence period, and as you said, I think it's a very welcoming kind of move that the in the younger generation, this anti-Brahminical assertion has become even more stronger.
Yes. Yes. See, I mean, the main, I mean, destroyer or no problem are no caste Hindus. I mean, it started with their migration into the forest areas. So British rule had gone, but they are there. I mean, it's, very much next to our door. So how to deal with them is very important, thing. Yeah.
Right, right. And I mean, I also feel that this is why this anti-Brahminical element needs to be there in the Adivasi movement as well, which is already, I mean, coming, because earlier, I mean, uh, uh, it has not seen Brahminism or Hinduism as the main enemy, but historically, as you are also pointing out, I think they are the caste Hindus, and Hinduism, Brahminism has been the main oppressor of Adivasi communities. Uh, Professor Bhukya, I mean, I I remember this. I mean, this. I had this experience at university. Uh, so I had a professor who told me that I should not use the term or indigenous, or I could not use the settler colonial framework to understand Adivasi history because, as we discussed, that India has had several waves of migration, several waves of colonialism. So the settler colonial framework does not apply to India. Can you talk a little bit about whether this settler colonialism framework is correct to understand realities of Adivasi communities, or is there a better way that we can, conceptualize, this violence, ongoing violence?
Yeah, see, that is the one way of no dismissing Adivasi assertion. Whoever the professor is very clever and very clear in his politics. Okay, but I mean, sir, I have no problem, and I see a lot of potential in this settler colonialism framework, and it is very much useful to study any Adivasi or indigenous community across the globe. Uh, so means in the sense like when you see a theory and ontology in a uh, against each other, definitely you get a different kind of understanding, right? Okay, so that is what this settler colonialism framework does. I mean, you read theory against the ontology, and ontology against the theory. So you read, you get a different kind of understanding of a whole thing. So I mean, in Indian context, as I told you, I mean, settlers are very much there. Okay, next to our door. Okay, and so how can they say that no, there is no settlers okay, in India, and you are completely occupied, colonized by the Brahmanical ideology. So unless you decolonize your thinking that upper caste or Brahmin is a great, and and value your system, your practices. Okay, so how can you liberate yourself? I mean, Adivasis have been protecting forests, okay, and living with the forest without destroying it. Okay, and there is, I mean, it's a lot of things actually one which one can can learn from the Adivasi communities. So how one would understand the whole thing, that's a very important thing, in the sense say each clan in a tribal society or Adivasi society is named after a animal or no a plant. So there is a human non-human relation between the two, and it is this relation which actually maintained ecological balance throughout the history, right? So and our modern conservationists, I mean, the forester, don't understand this logic. Okay, forests were ruined when the state began controlling the forest, right? Okay, so one has to decolonize this. I mean, so only state can only protect the forest. If you put the forest under state control, then only forest will be protected. This thinking is coming from outside, right? Okay, so unless we decolonize this, the Brahmanical values, okay, we have to decolonize Adivasi writings itself, right? Written by all non-Adivasis. There are so many derogatories, so many stereotypes. Okay, so how can we come out from this kind of constructions unless we decolonize those writings? So this coloniality and settler colonialism frameworks are now very very useful to Adivasi communities of India, and the experience are the same. Okay, so it is the modern state coming to Adivasi areas and occupying their land, occupying their resources, evicting them from their land. It is everywhere. And what is the wrong in using these frameworks used by Australian indigenous communities or Canadian or no American indigenous scholars? So I don't see any problems with this. So I mean, sir, there is there are scholars, there are people who make this argument that no, there is no indigenous community in India. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, and I think we'll continue this question about academia a little later. But before that, I would like to come back to uh, something that we couldn't finish about the question of Red Corridor, right? So, just to give an introduction, the Red Corridor is uh, the term used for the Maoist affected area in India, which largely comprises of Adivasi territories, across the mainland India, right, including Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Odisha, Maharashtra, Telangana, and so on. So, majority, the Maoist uprising has found its center in the Adivasi areas of Telangana, for instance, right? And uh, the first question is that how can we historically understand the ongoing Maoist insurgency in Adivasi areas? Then, secondly, as I introduced myself, that I grew up in Chhattisgarh, and I have had a lot of friends and relatives who have been at the receiving end of this violence on both the sides, right? So, in one of the essays for Caravan, I talk about how casualties during any of these encounters is whether it's Maoist or the security forces are mostly Adivasis and people from other marginalized communities. So, what are the historical structural problems that has led to this state? That this situation. And do you see that do you see an end to the counterinsurgency, rapes and killings and massacres of innocent Adivasis by the security forces anytime soon? You know.
What you said is 100% right, Akash. But going back to the history of the whole thing, is like you see these developments from late 60s. Okay, so as I told you, when British left India, there was a huge cry for national integration. So, and all the communities and individuals are now asked to sacrifice for the sake of nation and all that. And people actually you know very clever. They gave time something about 2 decades to the new nation. They in a way waited for the delivery of the new state. So, but nothing was moving, nothing was happening after independence. Okay, so then people started rising against the state. So this starts from late 60s. So it is not only the Adivasis, many peasant groups and workers, various social groups organized themselves and started you know giving slogans against the state. So one has to situate this within the larger context. I mean, so JP movement and um, um, say Lohia movement. These all were now coming part of this politics, and particularly after independence, there was when it comes to Adivasi question, there was only some public exhibitions by Nehru. I mean, so dancing with the tribal women, or no, say getting inaugurated certain programs by the Adivasis women. So these kinds of things were not happening. But there was no any concrete program for the development of the Adivasis. And on the other hand, there was a massive migration um, from the village society in the forest areas. So the kind of migration in the forest area was very huge between 50s and 70s in Adivasi areas. You take any area, not one area. Okay. So, and that brought a lot of pressure in the Adivasi areas. So, and then this one group of the Marxists adopt this while ultra Marxist kind of approach, and this bursted on the name of Naxalism and all that. So that spreads to particularly Andhra region. You must have heard of this Srikakulam Adivasi revolt of 1968, and then it spread to the whole of eastern India, Telangana. So there were a series of incidents in these areas. State was also suppressing, and these people were now going into forest area. So when the Maoist movement pick up to certain level, and speaking the political language which is very close to Adivasi question, then the Adivasis goes into influence of the Maoists. Okay, at that time they were called Naxalites. Okay, so that is how, I mean, many Adivasi communities become sympathizers. I mean, and became part of this, guerrilla underground warfare as well. So, and in many villages, actually, they, I mean, say, given some with their, I mean, some of his support, established their own self-rule. So all kinds of things were now happening. Okay, so and the other thing was like this revenue and forest department harassments were enormous during this period. Okay, so it was during this period this wildlife sanctuaries were now created, and these acts were also coming, particularly this 1980s Wildlife Protection Act made millions of Adivasis as a criminal overnight. Okay, in the sense you suppose means not to live in these sanctuaries areas. Okay, if you are living in forest areas, you are treated as a criminal. Okay, and many Adivasis were evicted from their land. Their hamlets were burned, they were tortured, their women were raped. So all these things are now happening. So a lot of violence actually. So this was happening in whole central India. Central Indian forest has a very fine quality take. Okay, even now from Rajura, the fine quality take Rajura, Gadchiroli, yeah, it is now in Gadchiroli district. Earlier, it was part of Hyderabad state. So there is a very big missionary which produce, I mean, parcel fine quality take to other parts of the world. So and state was also very much actually um, forcefully coming to, in a way, protect the, forest and all that. So all these were actually, in a way, force the Adivasi communities to go under Maoist influence. Okay, so in a way, I mean, the state was responsible for such a kind of condition in India. I mean, had the state acted positively towards the Adivasi question, this wouldn't have happened. Okay, so it's largely, means we have to blame failure of the Indian state. Okay, um, yeah. Then, of course, I mean, now state, as you are, mentioned earlier, they developed their own mechanism to suppress these, groups, and there is a lot of violence, uh, insurgency, and counter-insurgency, killing, both sides. So, but ultimately, as you said, it is the Adivasis and downtrodden communities who are losing their life. So, a lot of things, very disturbing things are now happening. But I don't know. I mean, where is the end to this kind of politics? But I must tell you, I mean, the Maoist movement, although they used forest area as a kind of protection cover, and depending on Adivasi communities for various things, for food, shelter, and various other things, but they did not build their politics centering on the Adivasi question. Okay, so the Maoist politics is basically built on the class politics. Okay. Another thing I wanted to tell you is Indian Marxists did not Indianized Marxism. That is the whole problem is. Whereas in other parts of the world, they localized Marxism, used the Marxism according to their needs. That is what happened in Latin America. Okay, that is what happened in China and Russia. So, but unfortunately, Indian communism or Marxism or Maoism, whatever name you call it, did not localize it. Okay, and that's what you see in the question when it comes to Adivasis as well. So I mean, they just used Adivasi areas for their own protection and all that. But what ultimately they have contributed or helped the Adivasis in asserting their rights. Okay, Adivasi rights. They give just symbolic slogans, but there is nothing actually. Of course, this kind of violence won't work in the present situation. I mean, Adivasi, I mean, if you see, the recent Patalgadi movement, I mean, it was a very historic movement. I mean, which has come from within. I mean, within the communities. So you are mentioning this Gondwana Mahasabha. There was Adivasi Mahasabha. So it is not that Adivasis don't have their own politics, right? They organized themselves. They have their own politics, and they have been articulating their question in a different way. But now, in a way, Maoist movement, because of Maoist movement, they are not even able to demand their rights. Okay, if you go with some demand to a Tahsil office and ask, I want this, you are questioning me, so I think you are a Naxalite, and they'll now put you in jail. Okay, so I interacted with some families. They say that our children who are studying graduation and the colleges, they are not coming to their villages, fearing that if they come to village, the police and armed forces brand them as an Naxalite and put them in jail. So once you are booked under some these kinds of cases, you are not eligible for again government jobs. So the Maoist movement in a way working very negatively for the Adivasis in this areas. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think slowly Adivasis are coming out from this fold and moving towards their own independent politics. Particularly, I mean, so the now educated section in the Adivasi communities are now thinking completely different. Okay, so I still have some hope for Adivasi independent politics. Okay, so let us hope for that. Yeah, yeah,
Right, right. Uh, this So, I mean, we were just talking about Telangana, and that reminds me that, it's your native state. So,
yeah,
I mean, I haven't asked you about your experience growing up, but can you maybe talk about growing up and, how your childhood was like, how your journey, uh, how was the journey that, brought you to
yes,
academia,
yes,
and
yes.
what kind of challenges that you faced. Yeah.
Yeah. Akash, it's again a long story. Sometime I also, I mean, don't realize how I come up to this level. There are so many hurdles, so many things, and many things were just happening accidentally. Like I going to school itself was a kind of no accident. So things were just happening, and from I mean, so our area again, as you said, was like a red cover area. So there was a lot of killings and a lot of politics happening. So I mean, I mean, so, there was a lot of things happening. I mean, so, when I was in school, so I was also with one of the left student organization. In a way, that helped me. I mean, so that helped me to develop critical thinking. So I started looking at various social, political, economic issues of the society more critically, and that actually also driven me towards social sciences. Okay, so not to go for physical sciences was one reason, right? Okay, so we should study about society. Okay, and then in a way, I mean, so my association with left wing politics helped me to in a way to get education, and there are guys who helped me financially also from the party affiliation, and they also guided me to go further, where to go and all that. So I was very much inclined, and of course, as I told you, there were many problems troubling me. But when I came to University of Hyderabad for my masters, there were a lot of things happening. This was in 93, 95. That was the time when this, I mean, so when I was in graduation first year, there was a this Mandal movement happening in 91. So Babri Masjid destruction was also happening that time. So a lot of political, philosophical transformation was happening in the early 90s in India. So that was the period when again this class movement to again identity based kind of movement were not taking up. Okay, So it was during that period, particularly in Telangana, number of caste-based movements were actually coming. It was during this period, BSP was also rising in North India. So all this were actually making me to rethink about the left movement and left politics in India. And I was more. I also started reading Ambedkar that time, and no, I mean, so those readings also had a strong impact on my thinking. So I, still hold that, like, India needs, caste and class-based kind of movement, a combined movement. India actually, requires. So, which would actually liberate all suppressed and oppressed communities of India. Okay, so that is my broad political transformation during my stay at HCU. Okay, and then fortunately, I got a position at a very early age at Usmania. So after completing my masters, I got position in Usmania. And then once, I mean, so that was my kind of dream to, get a teacher position. I didn't realize that I'll get a teacher position in universities. I was aspiring for no school teacher, but luckily, I got this position, and then I did not look back. From there, I decided to do PhD in abroad, and then I've been trying for fellowships, and luckily, Food Foundation came in my way, and I went to UK, Warwick University, to do my PhD, and and then things are now happening just like that. After PhD, yeah, I again came back and then joined back in Usmania, and then I published my thesis. Then I was asked to come to this IFLU University to start a social exclusion department. And then I developed that department, and then from there I moved to University of Hyderabad, where I am now teaching. So, and then last 25 years or so, I could manage to write some four monographs, two on Telangana history, two on Adivasi communities. So, and yeah, so my, yeah, that is how. But briefly, this is my academic.
Yeah, I was just wondering that, how your experience in academia has been, because we know that there is an overwhelming majority of scholars and writers who are from non-Adivasi, Brahmin, and upper caste communities who are theorizing and writing about the Adivasi history or experience, right? And these people, most of their works have most often misrepresented or distorted Adivasi realities, right? Which has been further reproduced through media, cinema, and so on, popular writing. Uh, as you already discuss in your paper, the mapping of the Adivasi social, colonial anthropology, and Adivasis. Uh,
That's my first major publication. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's a wonderful essay. It's one of my favorite essays because when you talk about Brahmin sociologists, you refer to them as Brahmin sociologists, and that is something that should be done. So you mentioned that Brahmin sociologists like G.S. Gurre and M.N. Srinivas, what kind of uh, wrong interpretation that they were giving of Adivasi communities, right? So, it's just a broader question on how do you see, that can we counter this kind of epistemic violence or domination of non-Adivasi communities in producing knowledge or literature about Adivasi communities.
Yeah. So, Akash, I mean, as a part of my master's, I did a course, History of Modern India, Social Change in Modern India. So, where, I was taught this M.N. Srinivas, Gure, Sanskritization, Westernization theories, and all that. So it says, Adivasis, lower castes are now imitating upper caste values and becoming Brahmins and all that. So those things actually disturbed me a lot. I mean, when I go and see in my Hamlet, there is nothing like, and how can these people say, we all becoming are not adopting a Brahminical values and becoming Brahmin. So and I mean, as you said, there is a very objectionable description of Adivasi communities, even in public literature like newspapers and novels, and in all kinds of literatures you see this kind of derogatories. And when you think of or any non-Adivasi, imagine Adivasi community, what comes to their mind is, half naked Adivasis dancing, always drinking, as if the other communities are not drinking and dancing and all that. So it is these things actually made me more rigorous academicians. Okay. So I do academics out of fashion. It's not just for my surviving or no living. Okay, I can live on so many things, but fascinately I do my job. So so I mean, there is a. I mean, I realize that there is a I mean, what do you call? There is a need to decolonize these writings, or hit back this writings, and carve out a more democratic space for the Adivasi communities, and that is what I have been doing. At least for the next generation, we should provide a proper, good understanding of Adivasi. That is my mission. Yeah.
That is really brilliant. Uh, because I think it's really important to not just talk about what kind of literature or research is being produced about the Adivasis, but what kind of relationship researcher and the researched have, and we have seen that how research itself, academia itself, becomes a tool for the state or for mining corporations to kind of uh, help them in further oppressing Adivasi communities, right? My next question was, connected to this, about how Professor Sabyasachi from Jamia Millia University, he has talked about this categorization of scheduled tribes based on their proximity to the forest, right? Uh, I mean, or at the same time, I mean, there are other ways of categorizing, classifying regional, historical, cultural diversity that the Adivasi communities have. Do you think there is a categorization that you endorse to, or something that previous scholars or anthropologists have done, historians have done, that you see helpful, in seeing diversity within, or hierarchy or inequality within the broader Adivasi schedule or scheduled tribe communities?
Akash, I mean, it's a very serious question now in the present context. There are a lot of movements going on, not only in Adivasi communities, but also in other backward communities as well as Dalit communities, where the lower one accuse the uh, dominant one and all that. So the argument is that no, the particular community is taking larger share in government schemes and job opportunities and kind of things is happening, and there is also serious problem. Only certain groups, certain communities are not taking advantage or no larger share in government schemes and other things. And there are some historical reasons for that. Now, a particular community is exposed to little bit more to larger system and aware of the system and knows how to exploit the system, so they are doing it. Okay, the other communities are not. But and as a result, what's happening is there is a lot of disparity within the community, between the communities. Okay, we cannot again uh, just make a holistic statement that this particular community is developed so much and so much. I live in a very luxurious apartment in Hyderabad, and when I look from my apartment down, there will be a Lambada woman collecting rubbish on the street. Okay, so there is a disparity. What I'm trying to say is within the community as well. Some families with some difficulties, I mean, could access modernity and come up in life, but others are still in a very very worse situation, right? So, and this disparity again varies region to region. Within the Telangana, if you see, for example, Lambada tribe, the northern Telangana Lambadas are now more advanced than the South Telangana Lambadas. Okay, so if you go to South Telangana, particularly Mabunagar, Rangareddy, and Nalgonda, this belt, there is a huge population, and they are still in a very precarious, worse condition. They all go to Bombay and other Hyderabad and other cities on migration as construction laborers. Okay, and you must have heard of giving up their girl child babies as well. So I mean, so I'm just giving one example. So similar thing you also see within the cones. So how do we address this? I mean, it's a question. Then I'm not saying there is no problem. There is a problem, but how to address this problem is a major thing. And categorization, can the categorization is a kind of a solution for this? That's another thing. I mean, so now the demand is categorization of these communities, or remove. There's a demand also to remove this community from the ST list. So these kinds of things are coming up. So but this is a very local issue. I mean, so that is how I see. So there should be some mechanism to handle things at the local level. No, I don't think we can have a one solution for the whole India. That is what I say. And so there is a problem. So it has to be handled at the local level. Who are the advantaged group? Who are the disadvantaged? and when you design the scheme, you should address certain schemes to the particular community, and you have to develop them in a particular way. You have to have a long period, machine to develop these communities. Say, I mean, sir, if there is no candidate, okay, if there is a position, even if you categorize, say for example A, B, C, D, and then you put particular communities in the D category, and there is a position in the D category, but there is no candidate. I mean, say for example, to get a lecturer position, one has to have a PhD, master and PhD. If there is no candidate with PhD in that particular community, obviously again that would go to some other community. Okay, right? So I mean, so, definitely, state will go for the next community, or no something, or no shifting that position to some other community. So these kinds of things would happen. So there should be some kind of mechanism by the state which can no, which can narrow down these gaps between the communities. Okay, so that is not happening. The problem is, like, state least bothered about these communities, and they don't see Adivasi communities particularly as a political force. Okay, and most of these constituencies are no, I mean, pockets are no reserved constituencies. So the upper caste leaders, they don't pay any attention. And our community person is basically kind of no pawn in upper caste leader. Okay, so they go by the party affiliation and all that. So, and sometimes he also thinks that I'm not winning only by the Adivasi votes. There are a lot of, I mean, so 40-50% non-Adivasis. So he always try to please them. So now in many constituencies, situation is created like, if you please the non-Adivasis, you will win the election, not the Adivasis. So that kind of thing has also got developed. So it's a very complicated, but I don't know how this professor is making this statement, but I'm not dismissing it. There is a problem, but the problem has to be addressed in a proper way. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I think it also kind of hints towards the kind of structural problem that we might have in understanding the category of scheduled tribe or the category of Adivasi, because when we are talking about such so many tribal groups, how do we address the aspirations and the autonomy and the languages and the cultures of so many different groups within this one political language of assertion, right? So, for example, particularly vulnerable tribal groups who are 75 or some numbers, right? Now, these communities, their language is endangered, their population is very less, and they are at the most bottom rung of this whole category, right? So, in that sense, I think it's also important to address how can we, for example, the voices of the Chenchus, voices of the Kolams or the Baigas or the Marias is rare. They rarely find space in the larger Adivasi articulation, where it has largely remained, kind of aspirations or, assertions of the communities who are from the larger communities, or the dominant communities.
Yeah, Akash, frankly, speaking, we are happy that now a Adivasi woman became president of India. But basically, it's a political move by the BJP and RSS guys. So the politics is to spread BJP politics in the Adivasi areas. So all these yes, they have been butchering Adivasis. We have seen in recent time the kind of violence BJP government has done and has been doing in Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, Orissa, and another parts of India. So I think to cover that and a kind of prize Adivasis got is like a Adivasi woman president. So that is how I see it. Yeah. So but how does it matters to Adivasi politics and Adivasis as a whole is a big question. Okay, I mean the problem with the democratic liberal politics is it is always controlled by the dominance, right? So it is not your own politics, okay? And particularly um, Adivasi politics runs on participatory democracy, not a representative democracy, okay? You must have seen our hamlets when there is a panchayat, okay, including children, attend, be part of this panchayat, okay. I mean, women come, all villagers, everyone come there with families in the panchayat and take part in it, right? So that is what democracy is for the Adivasi communities. So it is a participatory democracy. What we have today is a representative democracy, right? And it doesn't, even a representative democracy is polluted with so many things now, okay? And it is very difficult to act independently. You know? No, even if you are a president, or even if you are a prime minister, or some MLA or MP, you can't do anything to your people. You can't take a position on a particular issue. Okay, so even if you are president of India, you can't take a position. You cannot ask the authorities to stop so and so violence against the Adivasis. Can our Adivasi president stop the kind of multinational companies violence in Adivasi areas? She can't. She has no power. So it's of course the position itself is a symbolic position, but we are happy for that. But it doesn't matter to the Adivasis. It's not going to help to the Adivasis in any way. That is my understanding. Yeah, I'm sorry.